Good day. Today is Monday, 17th February 2025, and the EU's, Europe's, NATO in Europe's temper tantrum about the fact that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other and are looking to find some way, some means to bring the conflict to Ukraine to an end. Well, that temper tantrum continues. And if you consider that I'm exaggerating, look at this article in the Daily Telegraph, which has appeared today. And it reads, European leaders throwing temper tantrum over Ukraine talks. And in fact, as we will see, the person who's come up with the expression temper tantrum to describe what is happening is a former American official. European leaders are throwing a temper tantrum over being frozen out of early Ukraine peace talks, a former national security official said. Referring to an emergency meeting of Ukraine's European allies in Paris today, Fred Fleitz told the BBC, I don't know what the purpose of this summit is. The fact that European leaders are not involved is not an emergency. It seems to be FOMO, fear of missing out. I think European leaders are simply throwing a temper tantrum that they're not meeting with Putin today, that they're not going to be involved in meetings with Zelensky. Now, Fred Fleitz is a former CIA analyst and is vice chairman of the America First Policy Institute think tank. He is the co-author, together with General Keith Kellogg, of the article that appeared back in April last year during the US presidential elections, in which General Kellogg and Fred Fleitz condemned the Biden administration's whole approach to the Ukraine conflict, made some very, very valid criticisms of the way in which Biden had managed the conflict, and came up with various ideas which all sorts of people put together and assumed, wrongly as I thought, and as it has turned out, put together and thought was a plan. Well, anyway, Fred Fleitz now says that the European leaders are engaged in a temper tantrum, a hissy fit, that they're raging and fuming and being furious with each other, which is probably true, and they're trying to work each other up, and they're meeting in Paris to discuss this terrible news, this shocking news that Trump is speaking to Putin, and that American negotiators are meeting Russian negotiators in Saudi Arabia, and that there is talk in some way of ending the war in Ukraine. Anyway, they're fuming and furious about this, and they're angry about this, but they have no real reason to meet. There's no emergency, no critical emergency involving Europe that justifies their meeting. And there's no commonly agreed strategy. In fact, what the meeting in Paris is going to do, ultimately, apart from give them an opportunity to grandstand and express their displeasure and war dance, if you like, at the Americans' expense, all it's going to do ultimately is again highlight the many divisions that ultimately exist between them. Now, Prince amongst the hardliners is none other than the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Sir Keir Starmer, my Prime Minister, the leader of the country of which I am a citizen and a resident. And I can't begin to say how depressing I find that. Anyway, Sir Keir Starmer has now written an article in the Daily Telegraph. I'm not going to read it, but in it he takes an undiluted hard line on everything related to the conflict in Ukraine. He continues to insist that Ukraine must win, that the Russians must be punished, that the West must stand by Ukraine, that Ukraine is the front line of the West. And by the way, he also says the front line of Britain itself, that it is keeping the Russian army and Vladimir Putin at bay and is preserving Western civilization from falling under the Moscow yoke. I barely exaggerate. But he also says two things in this article which I find extremely disturbing and frankly infuriating when they're said at this time. He continues to insist that Ukraine is on an irreversible course towards NATO, something which completely cuts across what the Americans are now saying and what the Russians have always insisted on. And he also talks about his readiness, Britain's readiness, to send peacekeepers, or at least forces, soldiers, to Ukraine if a peace agreement is reached which requires it. I'll come to that later. Now, Sir Keir Starmer obviously knows that the idea of Ukraine joining NATO is unacceptable to the Russians. They've made that very clear. They've made it very clear that as far as they're concerned, that was the reason the war took place at all. The Russians repeatedly explained to the Western powers that as far as they were concerned, the Ukrainian entry into NATO was a red line. The American ambassador to Russia back in 2008, 2007, Bill Burns, Joe Biden's CIA director, wrote a famous telegram. Well, it's now a famous telegram since WikiLeaks published it. Anyway, a telegram back to Washington saying that it was the most bright and shining of all Russian red lines. And he, Burns, had not met a single member of the Moscow elite who disagreed with it from right across the entire Russian political spectrum. No means no, and that's what the Russians were saying then. And of course, we've had conflict in Ukraine ever since. We've had 3 years of war. The Russians stand on the brink of victory. But Keir Starmer must come along and insist that Ukraine is on an irreversible course towards NATO in spite of all of that. And he also, as I said, talks about peacekeepers, sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, even though Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who is on his way to Saudi Arabia, by the way, to meet the Americans, I will come to that shortly, he has said that for the Russians, having NATO contingents, military contingents from NATO countries in Ukraine would be problematic, to say the least. The Russians basically have already rejected that outright. And on the whole topic of peacekeepers, Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, recently made the point that peacekeepers can only be deployed according to international law to a conflict zone through a decision of the UN Security Council. And of course, Russia has a veto rights on the UN Security Council and can therefore veto any decision to send peacekeepers. A point that only struck me a little while later, by the way, is that Nebenzia's comment about the UN Security Council being the only body authorized to permit the deployment of peacekeepers actually goes beyond that. Because if the UN Security Council authorizes the deployment of peacekeepers to any area of conflict, it usually does so for only a limited period of time, generally a few years at most. And what is then supposed to happen is that the matter goes back to the Security Council once that limited period of time ends. And at that point, the Security Council must decide whether to renew the mandate for the peacekeepers. And of course, what that means is that, well, let's just assume that a decision is eventually made to deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine. I think this is most unlikely myself, but let's just assume that that were to be agreed and that it did happen. According to Nebenzia, it would have to be authorized by the UN Security Council. Almost certainly, in fact, definitely, the Russians would insist that the normal procedure were followed, so the peacekeepers would only be deployed for a limited period of time, perhaps 1 or 2 years. The matter would then revert to the Security Council, and if the Russians did not agree, when that period ended, to extend the peacekeepers' mandate. If the Russians, in fact, were to vote against extending the mandate, if they were to exercise their veto rights to do so, then the mandate would end, and according to international law, and almost certainly in practice, the peacekeepers would have to leave. So what Nebenzia is saying not only gives the Russians veto power over deployment of peacekeepers at all, but it also means that the Russians would have the right to veto extension of the mandate of the peacekeepers to remain at some future time. In other words, the Russians would be able to time limit the period that the peacekeepers were there, and at the end of that time limit, to insist that they leave, in effect, to have them booted out. So, just saying. So, anyway, Sir Keir Starmer disregards all of this. He's not listening to what the Russians are saying. He's not listening to what the Americans are saying. He nonetheless comes out and says these things, these extraordinary and outrageous things. He consists in taking the hardest possible line, and he does so, and it's important to say this, with the full backing of the entire political class in Britain. There is no significant figure in Britain who is speaking out against any of this. Nigel Farage, a couple of months ago, wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph questioning whether, in fact, Russia's war in Ukraine was indeed unprovoked. Farage made the entirely valid point that the war was, on the contrary, undoubtedly provoked through Western insistence that Ukraine would one day join NATO. I remember that the entire British political class united against Farage when he said that. There was a colossal outcry against him. And he's been very careful since then to keep his head down on this issue and to say nothing further about it. So, as I said, there is no real dissent from Starmer's line, which, incidentally, I have no doubt he believes in. I know that there are various people who think that Starmer is playing some clever Machiavellian game, that he's signing off 100-year agreements with the Ukrainians because he doesn't really believe that Ukraine will survive. 1 month, or 2 months, or 6 months, let alone 100 years. That he isn't serious about the irreversible course of Ukraine towards NATO, or about the deployment of the peacekeepers and all of those things. I'm going to say this. I believe that Keir Starmer believes every single thing that he is saying. In fact, I have knowledge that he does believe every single thing that he is saying. Indeed, I have heard reports about some of the things that he has been discussing with ministers and with officials. I can't unfortunately say what they are, but when I heard about them, they left me absolutely incredulous, demonstrating how completely out of touch with the actual situation Keir Starmer actually is. Anyway, that's him. He is taking the hardest possible line. He's backed by his friends in Scandinavia, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, and the Danes. Scandinavia has gone from a position during the Cold War of approximate neutrality. It was known during the Cold War that Sweden leaned strongly towards the Americans, and Finland was in the Soviet sphere of influence. But overall, it was widely understood that despite that, they were basically neutral, or at least they went through the motions of pretending they were neutral. Anyway, they've gone from that position during the Cold War to one of fervid Atlanticism and implacable hostility to Russia, and very much as in Britain, they take the most extreme, the hardest possible, the most bitterly anti-Russian line that it is possible to take. And of course they're joined in that by the Baltic states as well, which famously a week ago disconnected themselves from the Russian electricity grid, pronounced that this was freedom, and have apparently, as a result, experienced a quadrupling of electricity prices. I believe that this is actually the case, that electricity prices in the Baltic states have quadrupled. I might be overstating it a bit, that they have shot up by staggering levels. That, I understand, is indisputable fact. Anyway, those three countries, the Baltic states, the Scandinavians, the British, they can all be assumed at this meeting in Paris to be taking the hardest possible line. And on some of these points, Starmer will also receive the backing of his partner in crime, if I can call him that, the Napoleon of Europe, the Caesar of the Seine, the genius of the Elysee, Emmanuel Macron. He, of course, was the first person about a year ago to float the possibility of sending European troops to Ukraine. This is massively unpopular with the French people. I understand and believe that it is massively unpopular within the French army as well. But nonetheless, he continues to insist on it. He's been talking about how it is essential that Europe find some means to prevent the capitulation of Ukraine. This is what Macron is saying. He's resurrecting again plans for European armies and all of that. Anyway, he, at least at this meeting in Paris, which of course it was Macron, who took the decision to convene it. Anyway, he will no doubt be supporting Starmer in all of this as well. No one else is. Apparently the Germans, and I understand that this is a consensus in Germany, I understand that both Scholz and Merz are in agreement about this. The Germans have said that they will not agree to send any troops as a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. Poland has made the same decision. Donald Tusk has said that under no circumstances will Poland send troops as a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. The reality is that since the start of the special military operation in February 2022, the Poles have sent lots and lots of troops to Ukraine. They've sent lots of troops who have been serving there, purportedly as volunteers or as mercenaries. The Russians complain about their presence all the time. Poland has provided Ukraine with huge amounts of weapons and military material. I think I'm right in saying that Poland has been the biggest single supplier of tanks, for example, to Ukraine. They're not so visible because they are essentially Soviet T-72s, which Poland can build under license, a license granted to Poland when it was a member of the Warsaw Pact by the Soviets during the Cold War. The Poles have regularly updated and improved these T-72s, and of course the Poles have provided all sorts of other weapon systems as well. Every day, well, not every day, but quite often, you read from Russian Defense Ministry reports of Polish weapon systems being destroyed by the Russian army on the Ukrainian battlefields. Crab self-propelled guns, in particular, provided to Ukraine from Poland, seem to be amongst the special weapon systems that the Russian Defense Ministry most singles out whenever any one of them has been destroyed. So Poland is not going to send troops to Ukraine. They've already suffered, as I understand it, very significant losses during the period of the special military operation. The Polish public is tired and disenchanted about the conflict in Ukraine. There have been constant tensions since basically 2023 between the Polish and Ukrainian governments, both the existing government and the previous government led by the Law and Justice Party. The Poles often pose as staunch, even fervid supporters of Ukraine, but beneath the surface it's clear that they're not keen at all. And my sense is that all of the other European countries are going to basically follow the line taken by Germany and Poland. They will not send troops to Ukraine. I think it is inconceivable, for example, that the Czechs, the other Balkan states, Italy has, of course, always ruled out any possibility of deploying forces to Ukraine. Anyway, all of the European countries so far, apart from the British and the French, and perhaps the Baltic states, have ruled out sending troops to Ukraine. And the fact that the Americans have said unequivocally, Pete Hegseth said this in his speech to the Munich Security Conference, that the Americans have said unequivocally that any European troops deployed to Ukraine will not be protected by the United States will not be provided with American security guarantees. I am sure that for most European states, that settles the matter. They are not going to send their troops into harm's way, facing off against the terrifying Russian army without a guarantee of American protection. Now, on that topic, I would say that for a few short hours after Pete Hegseth spoke, all sorts of people claimed or pretended to claim that though Pete Hegseth was ruling out deployment of ground troops to Ukraine, the possibility that the US could provide air cover, that was still open. Well, I've now looked at Pete Hegseth's words. I've read them through precisely. I have to say, I always thought that was desperate, and I can see definitely that it emphatically is desperate. And he says if his actual words were as follows: if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, and notice the if, in other words, Pete Hegseth leaves open the possibility that they might not be. Just saying. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. So that doesn't speak of ground forces. It refers to US troops generically. And I take that to mean that the United States is not going to provide air cover either. I think people have read those words of Pete Hegseth and have inserted into them meanings that simply are not there. And as I said, I think most European states understand that, and they will not agree to deploy forces without guarantees of American protection to Ukraine. So I think this whole idea of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine is going to be stillborn. I think it's all but inconceivable that the Russians will agree. If they do agree, it will be on the strictest possible terms set out by Vasily Nebenzia, but I don't think that that is, in fact, at all the Russian intention. I think that the Russians have consistently said that they do not want European troops, NATO troops, or troops from NATO countries in Ukraine, and I'm sure that will be the position they will stick to. They have previously consistently rejected, even before the start of the special military operation, even during the period when there were attempts still being made to make the Minsk agreement work. The Russians consistently opposed deployment of peacekeepers to Ukraine. There was no word of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of the Istanbul agreement, and I don't think the Russians are going to withdraw from that, and I don't think that that is going to happen, or at least troops from Britain and France are not going to go to Ukraine as peacekeepers. Anyway, just to move on. So already we see the division. Starmer wants to unite the Europeans to get them to send a large army to Ukraine. Most European countries, despite their anger, despite their fury, despite the fear that stalks all of them, won't agree. And as for the irreversible course towards NATO, well, of course, there's already lots of European countries which are members of NATO which already don't agree with that. Hungary, Slovakia, before long, I'm sure the Czech Republic, after Mr. Babiš is re-elected, if he is re-elected. Romania, perhaps, after Mr. Georgescu becomes president, if he is allowed to become president. I don't think this is going to happen either. In fact, I'm sure that it isn't going to happen because the Russians, again, are going to insist that it doesn't happen. And as they have won the war, or are winning the war, they are unequivocally in the driver's seat. So what is the point of this meeting? Just as Fred Flight says, but what are they really meeting to talk about and to discuss? Well, Hungary's very astute Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, has now said that this is, in reality, a meeting of people who want to ensure that the war continues. The way he put it earlier today was like this. Today, Paris will host a meeting of those who've been constantly adding fuel to the fire of war in Ukraine for the last 3 years. These countries are for the war. They have supported the misguided strategy of sanctions. These states have constantly escalated the conflict. Today, the parties supporting the war are coming together in Paris, and they oppose peace and Trump. They want to do everything in their power to prevent a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. And frankly, that is exactly what this meeting, in the end, is about. They're not really looking to send peacekeepers to Ukraine. They don't really expect Ukraine to join NATO anytime soon. They're creating problems and obstacles. They're trying to sabotage the progress of the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. And when eventually the Russians square off with the Ukrainians across the negotiating table, as will eventually happen, they want to ensure that the Ukrainians feel, or are led to believe, that the Europeans are there behind them and will continue to support them. If they reject any US or Russian proposal that might lead to peace, so that the war can continue. And Zelensky appears to be playing along. He has just made further statements to the effect that if Ukraine doesn't participate in the discussions, then it will simply reject any outcome that comes out of the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. Ukraine will not compromise, apparently. It will not agree to any significant concessions. Even if the Americans walk away, it will continue the war. And in fact, the giveaway in all of this, in what was really going on in Paris, was, I understand, made not by Prime Minister Starmer himself, but by one of his officials, who said that the objective is to prevent any division, any breakdown in the unity of the Western alliance, to keep Britain, NATO, the Europeans and the Americans, to hold them together. And how do you do that? You do that by prolonging and protracting and continuing the war in Ukraine. Because if the Americans and the Russians start talking to each other, if they start coming to agreements with each other, if they start developing a relationship with each other, then the value of NATO for the Americans diminishes, and so does the value of America's European allies. Having heard what Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance had to say, the British, French, all of them in fact, are saying to themselves, if the Americans and the Russians do reach agreements with each other, if the war in Ukraine is brought to an end and is put to one side, the Americans are going to be provided with the space and the opportunity that they want to leave, and quite plausibly at that point they will leave, because, as they say themselves, with the rise of China, they have other priorities. So that's what this is all about. That is ultimately the true purpose of the meeting in Paris. It's not intended to come up with any constructive ideas. The Europeans have no constructive ideas. Keir Starmer has no ideas at all. As I said, he's still stuck on Ukraine joining NATO and British troops being sent to Ukraine, and Macron is no different. It's all about undermining the prospects of a negotiated solution, one brokered by the Americans and agreed by the Russians, a solution which could potentially bring the war to an end and which might lead to the Americans quitting Europe and going away, as in their very different ways Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance have both hinted at. Well, this is sterile, it's negative, it is not in any way putting forward constructive ideas. In fact, what it represents is the bankruptcy of policy and diplomacy. It means choosing war over peace. It means choosing more dead Ukrainians over live ones. It means more destruction on Ukrainian cities. It means the perpetuation of divisions in Europe and the indefinite perpetuation of conflict with Russia. The Americans are becoming tired with it. So are some European countries. It is probably unsustainable over the long term, but it must be said that the British do have their friends in Washington. The neocons in Washington have not all disappeared. They still have their friends in Congress. It is not impossible that the Europeans with the British at their lead, might succeed in throwing the negotiations off course, in preventing a settlement from being reached. Well, do they have alternatives? I've often said in many programs that even if there was little real prospect of intelligent alternatives being followed, it's always best to remember that they do exist, that decisions to make war and prolong war, even as that war is being lost, that those sort of decisions stem from conscious choices. And there's been a truly outstanding tweet by one of the most astute of commentators, Arnaud Bertrand. You can find it on X, in which he charts what alternative policies the Europeans might conceivably follow. He makes the point, which I've made already, that it's absolutely incredible that the Americans and the Russians are now talking about the security of Europe without the participation of the Europeans. Lavrov, by the way, has addressed this question today. He said, why would the Europeans be invited to participate when their approach is purely negative? They insist on sending arms to Ukraine. They insist on prolonging the war. So what purpose or function would be served by having them present in the talks, given that they are committed to prolonging the war, their only purpose would be to wreck any peace talks so that the war could continue. Anyway, Arnaud Bertrand says it is absolutely unbelievable. It is incredible that we've come to this, that the affairs of Europe are being decided by two superpowers, America and Russia, without the direct participation of the European states. He says that this is a product of the unbelievable incompetence of the European leadership, about which he is perfectly right, and then he proposes alternatives. Now, I'm not sure that I agree with these alternatives or think that these alternatives are achievable, but I'm just going to read what he says. He says one idea would be to out-Trump Trump and to angle for a deal where the United States, not Europe, ends up the loser. I can't really see how that's possible myself, but anyway. He goes on to say they could, for instance, finally tell the truth about what led to the war in the first place, namely NATO expansion pushed by the United States, as well as the United States-led coup in Ukraine, and dissociate themselves from this, just the way Trump is very conveniently trying to dissociate himself from his own country's previous policies. The problem with doing that, of course, is that the Europeans were full accessories to all of those things. Many European states, including Britain, by the way, fully backed the 2008 decision at NATO's Bucharest summit to basically invite Ukraine to apply for NATO membership. Just saying. So they were full parties to that. And of course, European states, including some of the people who are in power in Europe today, were deeply implicated in the Maidan coup of 2014. One of the people who was actually present in Kiev at the time of the Maidan coup was none other than Radek Sikorski, who was at that time Foreign Minister of Poland, and who is, of course, a full member of the Polish government to this day. Just saying. Anyway, that's one thing that Arnaud Bertrand says. Then he says this: they could make it clear that they reject any deal that gives the United States access to any of Ukraine's resources, and signal to Russia that they're open to a different kind of security architecture in Europe, one that doesn't rely on US leadership or NATO. After all, if Trump can say he'll make deals with Putin, why couldn't Europe do the same? Absolutely. And here I am fully in agreement with Arnaud Bertrand. It seems to me that nothing at all prevents the European states from approaching the Russians themselves, saying to the Russians, look, this has all been an absolute catastrophe. Let's talk. Let's see whether we can agree some long-term security arrangements for Europe, security arrangements which obviously involve ourselves and in which we obviously have a direct interest in order to bring peace and stability to the continent that we share. I'm not sure how the Russians would react to that. I'm not sure how Putin would react to that. But certainly it would be the obvious thing for the Europeans to do, except, of course, they're not doing it. And Arnaud Bertrand then goes on to say they could also reach out to China, which has already made it very clear that it opposed a deal in Ukraine without Europe at the table. That, I believe, actually is a misunderstanding of Chinese statements. I think that it's based on a report from Reuters, which I think greatly overstated what the Chinese actually had to say. But Arnaud Bertrand says that China is anyhow much better positioned to negotiate with Russia than Trump is. And I would add to that, even if Arnaud Bertrand is perhaps somewhat wrong about the Chinese position on the ongoing negotiations, it is absolutely true that the Chinese have repeatedly reached out to European leaders, to the Germans, to the French. Xi Jinping made a big effort to establish a good relationship with Macron. The Chinese have been very, very keen to establish a long-term, stable economic relationship with Europe. They've been frustrated and angered by the fact that the Europeans have shown little interest in achieving it. And as part of some sort of grand bargain, again, European states, if they had two brain cells to rub together, if they had any kind of active diplomacy, well, they could turn to China, they could work with the Chinese, and as part of some kind of grand bargain involving Russia and Ukraine, they could work with the Chinese to achieve a settlement in which they, the Europeans, had a central role and which they would themselves have helped to negotiate. Well, Arnaud Bertrand goes on to say that we could end up with a Europe freed from American tutelage for the first time since 1945, establishing a new multipolar equilibrium with China and Russia, turning Trump's attempt to exclude Europe into the very catalyst that finally enables European strategic autonomy. All absolutely true, but of course that reverses what the Europeans are actually trying to do. As we've seen, the British are saying that the most important thing is to preserve the alliance with the United States, and that's their objective. They want to maintain the system of American hegemony and tutelage because they believe, falsely, that by maintaining the collective West, that enables them, that is to say the British, the French, the Germans and all of the others, to strut across the world, play the game of being great powers, even though objectively they are, of course, no such thing. Rely on American power, the backing of the United States, to fool everyone else in continuing to think that they are important. And they're so wedded to this that they want to prolong the war in order to keep the Americans in Europe rather than end it. But if you really care about Europe, if you think about Europe in the way that Arnaud Bertrand does, you'd be absolutely right. You would say, surely it's better for Europe to stand for itself, for European countries to rediscover their independence and autonomy again, to start behaving once more like real countries rather than like parts of the great jigsaw that is the collective West. I would say, by the way, and this is just by way of aside, that I think that one of the major reasons why in Britain there is so much of an obsession with the last years of the 1930s, the debates that took place right up to the moment of the declaration of war against Germany in September 1939. Why there have been so many books, so many articles written about this, why the Munich conference and what happened there is trotted out so often, why it is depicted in film after film and television show after television show, is because that is the last time when Britain acted entirely by itself and for itself without the American mentor and tutor hovering over the just behind, basically pulling the strings. But as I said, they don't want that. That is not what the Europeans really want, certainly not what the British want. They want to keep their position as vassals to the hegemon in the great project of the collective West. They want to stick with what the German philosopher Nietzsche would have called the slave mentality, which they have developed over the last 80 years. So again, Arnaud Bertrand is right, but it's important to say that that is not what the Europeans want. And then Arnaud Bertrand finishes, this would require a level of strategic thinking that current European leaders have consistently shown themselves incapable of. Instead, I'm afraid they'll continue their current path of attempting to maintain the facade of transatlantic unity, even as they're being openly humiliated. And about that, he is absolutely right, and I hope I have explained why. Anyway, there we are. A bankrupt summit led by bankrupt leaders who have no positive ideas to offer, no constructive suggestions to take forward, who wasted the last 3 years trying to win an unwinnable war, who sacrificed probably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives to that enterprise, who have destroyed Ukraine, who have isolated themselves and humiliated Europe, but they can't let go. They won't give up, and they will persist, and we'll have more declarations and more pronouncements from them over the next couple of hours. Probably you'll be getting some of those pronouncements even as this program goes up. Because they're so frustrated and so angry that they're being excluded from the discussions and are so horrified that the world that they have known, one in which they're vassals of the United States, but vassals who can pretend that they're part of a joint enterprise, that world is coming to an end. There's an astonishing video in which the German official who was tasked with organizing and chairing the Munich Security Conference breaks down into tears because of what has happened. And I think that what happened over the course of that conference, and I think that basically summarizes both the feelings and the realities in today's Europe, at least amongst its governing class. Well, I'm not going to waste any more time on these people. Let's turn to what the countries with actual agency, the Russians and the Americans, are doing. Well, Rubio, Mike Waltz and Stephen Witkoff are apparently now in Riyadh, waiting for the Russians to come. The Russians, Peskov, has announced who the Russians are sending to meet the Americans in Riyadh, and it's going to be the formidable duo of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and, as I predicted, Putin's foreign policy aide, the extremely tough and very clever Yuri Ushakov, who is something of an expert, by the way, on the US, and who, as I recall, like Lavrov, speaks excellent English. So they will be meeting Rubio and the others in Riyadh. MBS, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, will be there. He will apparently be chairing the meeting. He will actually be present. And the purpose of the meeting is not apparently to reach any substantive agreements on the conflict in Ukraine, but to prepare the groundwork for a meeting which could take place next week, also in Riyadh, also with MBS participating, the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And Trump, by the way, has expressed relief that the Russians have confirmed that they are prepared to talk about Ukraine. He's admitted that the Russians have a formidable war machine. Interesting admission. He's also admitting that it would have been very difficult for the United States if the Russians had refused to talk. In effect, an admission that the Russians hold all the high cards, something I have said in program after program, and which we have all also discussed on the Duran. The Russians are coming to Riyadh. They're going to meet the Americans, not just because they are going to discuss Ukraine, that will obviously be an important topic for discussion, but because, as is absolutely clear and has now been acknowledged in the Financial Times, the discussion is going to be about the full normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. And I discussed, I think it was yesterday in my program, how the transcript of that the Russians have published, or rather the readout the Russians have published, of the Lavrov Rubio conversation shows that there is now active discussion about lifting all sanctions, allowing trade, economic contacts, and investment to resume. There are reports today of Russian officials discussing how MasterCard and Visa might return to Russia. The Russians are saying to each other that if Visa and MasterCard do return to Russia, they will find a completely altered economic landscape. They will not achieve the kind of monopoly position that they had before, and it is most unlikely that most Russians will return to Visa and MasterCard. They will almost certainly choose to stick with their Mir cards, and I believe that is absolutely true, by the way. But anyway, there will be, that is the purpose of the meeting in Riyadh. And the meeting that is going to happen between Lavrov and Rubio and the others, which is going to take place tomorrow, and the forthcoming summit meeting in Riyadh between Putin and Donald Trump. Now, the purpose of tomorrow's meeting, apparently, Steve Witkoff has said that one of the purposes is to try to rebuild trust. An interesting admission, by the way, from Witkoff, acknowledging the enormous damage that has been done to trust, the question of trust, in US-Russian relations as a result of the previous actions taken by Obama, who the Russians bitterly resent and consider the ultimate author of the whole crisis, and of course Biden and his people. Anyway, Witkoff is talking about the need to restore that trust, but we're also told that the meeting tomorrow will be, as it is said, a logistical one, basically to set the scene for the Putin-Trump summit which is to come. And I'm going to say, I think that the major objective, the major point of discussion is tomorrow is going to be to try to agree the agenda, the various topics that the Americans and the Russians, Putin and Trump, are going to discuss with each other when they meet. And what they will want to talk about, obviously, is Ukraine. The Americans are now acknowledging that they don't have an actual plan. I didn't think they did, by the way. But they want to work towards working out a framework. This is what Rubio is saying. So they want to talk about Ukraine. They want Putin and Trump to discuss some mechanism going forward, aiming towards a settlement, an eventual settlement of the war in Ukraine. But of course, they also want to talk about all of the other things that Putin and Trump touched on in their telephone conversation of 5 days ago. So they want to talk about the status of the dollar, which is a huge concern to the United States. Trump does not want to see the dollar lose its reserve status whilst he is president. He needs the dollar to retain its reserve status whilst the United States readjusts its economic model, which is what he's trying to do. Putin can reassure him about this. The Russians at the moment, the BRIC states, are not in a position to launch their own reserve currency. As Alex Christoforou and I have discussed, as we discussed at length at the time of the Kazan summit, the objective there was not to create an alternative reserve currency to the dollar. It was to set up mechanisms for trade and financing, circumventing the obstacles created by the United States in order to allow trade between the various BRIC states to develop and grow. And by the way, I think as well as providing reassurance that, as I said, there's no immediate plan to dethrone the dollar as the world's reserve currency, I think the Russians, Putin, will also explain to Trump that the infrastructure, the payments infrastructure being created in Kazan, which was created and discussed in Kazan, is non-negotiable. The Russians are not going to go back on any of that, nor will the other BRIC states. But setting it up should not be seen as an immediate or prospective challenge to the dollar. So there can be discussions about that too. That means that the Russians can then start trading their energy freely. They can start accepting dollars again. If they want to sell liquefied natural gas in Europe or elsewhere, or oil in Europe or elsewhere, the Russians can start to trade in energy products, and they can accept dollar payments. And they will, of course, also, obviously, ask for the refund of their reserves as part of this deal, and for guarantees that the whole Euroclear thing, the freezing of their assets, will not ever recur again. And quite plausibly, we will see steps taken to bring the Russian banks back into a situation where they use SWIFT or can use SWIFT, even though, again, this will happen against a completely different economic landscape, certainly within Russia and with many other countries. The Russians will continue to work through the various payment systems that they have created. So that will definitely be one topic that they will discuss, and it will be part of the agenda that's going to be agreed when Lavrov and Rubio meet tomorrow. And other things that they will also discuss is Iran, its nuclear program, the Palestinian issue, North Korea, who knows what other things, but the many, many topics and issues the Americans and the Russians can, of course, discuss with each other. So there'll probably be quite a lot to say with a view to sorting out the agenda, and there'll certainly be quite a lot to say about Ukraine as well. But as I said, this will be a preparatory meeting prior to the big summit meeting between Putin and Trump that is going to take place next week. Now, there are reports circulating right across the Russian media today, including TASS, the TASS news agency, and various Russian newspapers, and I've also seen them reported in the Financial Times, that Lavrov has made certain comments about territory with respect to Ukraine. Now, I have not yet read Lavrov's exact words because the Russian Foreign Ministry has not yet provided a transcript. But what I understand Lavrov has said is that there will be no territorial concessions by the Russians to Ukraine as a result of any negotiations. In other words, the Russians are sticking to the position outlined by Putin at his speech to the Foreign Ministry in June 2024, that the four regions in their entirety are Russian territory and must be accepted as such by Ukraine, that the Ukrainians must accept that they're not going to be able to retain any part of the four regions. Doubtless, the Foreign Ministry will provide a transcript of Lavrov's comments tomorrow, and I expect I will return to what he said when that transcript finally appears. So, there we are. Discussions between the Americans and the Russians going on in Riyadh, preparing for the summit meeting between Putin and Trump next week. Ukraine, the problem in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine being looked at and addressed, but being looked at and addressed in the context of a general drive by the Americans and the Russians to normalize their relations, to have all sanctions lifted. And I've explained why in previous programs. It is in American interests to lift the sanctions. Donald Trump wants to bring down inflation in the United States. In order to bring down inflation in the United States, he needs lower prices for energy. To do that, he needs to unblock all the restrictions on the free trade and export of Russian energy products. He also perhaps would like some kind of understanding with the big energy producers and exporters, with Russia and Saudi Arabia, with whose leaders he's going to be meeting next week. It makes complete sense in terms of America's own economic agenda. And insofar as the United States is now engaged in rivalry with China and is increasingly seeing China as the major adversary, re-establishing an economic relationship with Russia puts the United States in a position where, though the Russians are not going to become equidistant between China and the United States, that possibility has long gone. The Russians will be less antagonistic towards the United States than they are now, and therefore perhaps less likely to cause trouble for the Americans in Europe or in the Middle East if the United States finds itself in conflict with China at some point in the future. Meanwhile, the Europeans, sidelined, fuming, fretful, angry, having a tantrum, talking angrily with each other, talking about Donald Trump's betrayal and all that, but unable to come up with any ideas of their own, terrified that despite everything the Americans might choose to walk away, with no constructive plans about what to do about Ukraine, and with their divisions about deployment of peacekeepers to Ukraine highlighted over the course of these Paris discussions. As for the Ukrainians, the most comically tragic, if I can put it like that, illustration of the position that they are now in has been provided by Zelensky himself. Even as the Americans and the Russians are about to meet, Zelensky took a flight to the UAE. He arrived there, and it was absolutely obvious to me what he was up to. He was intending to try and gatecrash the American-Russian meeting in Riyadh. He was planning to fly on to Riyadh. He was hoping to see MBS, to get MBS to allow him to join, to go into the room where the Americans and the Russians would be meeting and speaking with each other. Zelensky has done this sort of thing before. He's gatecrashed meetings in other places. He did that, as I remember, some time ago with an Arab League summit. And he did this also. He gatecrashed meetings. As I also remember, I think it was at a G20 summit as well. But anyway, this time that ploy failed. The Saudis politely told him that he's absolutely welcome to come and visit their country. He's absolutely welcome to meet MBS himself, but he cannot come on the 18th of February when the Americans and the Russians are meeting and talking with each other. He will have to come on the day after that, on the 19th, because MBS is busy with the Americans and the Russians on the previous day. And of course, this meeting, this visit on the 19th of February had been planned anyway a long time before. Well, again, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. That's all I can say. So anyway, Zelensky kept away, the Europeans kept away, the Americans and the Russians meeting and speaking, a summit meeting between Putin and Trump being prepared, the Europeans, their heads exploding with their anger, out of anger. But the reality is that they have nowhere to go, nothing they can do. They're spectators looking at everything from the outside. And as Arnaud Bertrand correctly said, they themselves have brought themselves and the European continent to this abject point. Now, I mentioned China a moment ago, and I think it's worth saying that the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, did also attend the Munich Security Conference. It is an interesting and strange fact that his rather interesting speech, in fact, his very interesting speech, to the Munich Security Conference went by basically without being noticed. But anyway, Wang Yi did speak, and it was a most interesting speech that he gave, and actually a rather short one. And he set out there China's vision for the future of international relations. And he did so in a way that was clearly intended to contrast with the approach of the Americans. And he said this, and I'll read briefly his words. He said, "Will multipolarity bring chaos, conflict, and confrontation? Does it mean domination by major countries and the strong bullying the weak?" By the way, I've noticed that very tediously, again, people have taken to misquoting Thucydides, the Greek historian, just as people have been misquoting Thucydides about the so-called Thucydides trap, which Thucydides never described. They now trot out a sentence which you will indeed find in Thucydides, that the strong do what they want and the weak do what they must. What is never mentioned whenever that quote appears is that it appears in a speech which Thucydides attributes to the representatives of Athens, the ancient Greek superpower, who were behaving in an incredibly cruel and brutal way towards one of their former allies, the small island of Melos, which they crushed and basically depopulated. Thucydides does not approve of this statement. Clearly, on the contrary, he thinks it's wrong, and it does not and should not be taken to reflect his views as an accurate reflection of how international affairs ought to be conducted. I'm not going to discuss this further. This is a huge topic for discussion. Discussions of Thucydides can appear in many places. There's an enormous amount of criticism. He is a writer from my own culture, and I get very frustrated by seeing how often his words are taken and given the exact opposite meaning to the one he intended. But anyway, this is what Wang Yi is talking about. He says, does multipolarity mean domination by major countries and the strong bullying the weak? And he goes on to say, China's answer is, we should work for an equal and orderly multipolar world. This is another major proposition put forward by President Xi Jinping, and it respects our sincere expectation for a multipolar world. China will surely be a factor of certainty in this multipolar system and strive to be a steadfast, constructive force in a changing world. And then Wang Yi went to outline 4 major approaches that should be taken, which is, in order to make this all possible, equal treatment between big powers and not so big powers, respect for international law, actual practice of multilateralism, openness, a policy of openness, and pursuit of mutual benefit. Now, you can take all of this with a huge amount of cynicism, and perhaps one would be justified in doing that. But this is a different perspective on international relations, or at least a declared different perspective on international relations from the one that you still hear from the United States, including from the Trump people. The Americans still see international relations in terms of great power competition and rivalry, in terms of conflict between great powers. To the extent that they talk about diplomacy, they see diplomacy as being there to manage conflict. So the United States now sees China as a rival, and therefore, since China is a rival, it must be an adversary. What the Chinese are saying is, no, that's wrong. We are glad that you accept that the system is now becoming multipolar, that the period of unipolarity has ended. That is a good thing. But we don't need to be rivals and adversaries. It is not a zero-sum game. It's not America versus China. That's not how the system should work. The way it should work is that all of us should get together, accept certain basic rules, treat each other with respect, with openness, with empathy, and work to try to manage the system in our own interests, but also in each other's interests in an optimal way, in order to benefit not just ourselves, but ultimately humanity taken as a whole. Some people will say that is a utopian vision, an idealistic one, but it is an attractive one, and it is one which will undoubtedly win China friends in many parts of the world. Anyway, that was China. Now, it's impossible to deny that all of these recent changes, this huge change in US policy, is a direct product of the war in Ukraine. I'm going to express here my own personal opinion. If the Biden administration had been successful in its objectives, if the Russian economy had indeed collapsed in March 2022, if Russian GDP had indeed halved, if there'd been hyperinflation in Russia, and if Putin had been forced from power, if the United States had regained the dominant influence in Russia that it had had in the 1990s, if the Russian army had been defeated and destroyed, then my own view is that the Democrats would still be in power in the United States, the neocons would still be in charge of US foreign policy. In fact, they would be, or they would feel themselves to be, unstoppable. And it's unlikely that Donald Trump would have been re-elected president, and we would not be seeing, obviously, the great sea change in American foreign policy that we are seeing now. There is, in fact, a brilliant article in the National Interest, one which has again been drawn to my attention by the historian Jeffrey Roberts, by Brandon Weichert, which says Donald Trump's Ukraine war endgame comes into focus. In all but name, the Ukraine war is over, and further NATO expansion is likely over too. Only time will tell if Russia is content with this resolution. And the point is, and he says though quite explicitly in this article, that the Russians are now in the driving seat because they have won. They have won the war in Ukraine. And there is really no doubt about this. It is the Americans that have been forced to come round. The Trump administration has made it clear they're negotiating an end to the seemingly interminable war, Ukraine war, without Ukrainian inputs. Ukraine will simply have to come round. Ukraine was not able to fight Russia without military aid from the United States. It cannot therefore do so. It will ultimately have to accept whatever the Americans and the Russians want it to accept. And the point is that the Russians defeated Ukraine and they defeated the collective West. The fact is that again I'm quoting, the Ukraine war is over. Trump has not come out and said this explicitly, but in thought and deed, the Americans under Trump have ensured that the war cannot be fought on. The Russians have defeated Ukraine. By extension, Moscow has beaten NATO too. At the very least, this is what Putin's government will tell its people. To much of the world, this will be the takeaway as well. There are many people who will not want to hear it, but judging how the war has been going, without the negotiations, the Russians will have defeated the Ukrainians on the battlefield. This is why Ukraine will seek a negotiated settlement, even that cedes most, if not all, of the territory that Russia has captured. A humiliating peace would be preferable to a total defeat of Ukraine by Russia. That's not just the Ukrainians who are now obliged to think in that way. It is the Americans quietly who think that too. Some people like Keir Starmer want to pretend otherwise, but that is the reality. Now, given that this is so, as I have said, it will be the Russians who ultimately will dictate the peace. That is all that remains to be decided now. Fighting will continue for a few months. I suspect that the Americans will probably, however, work to try to get the major obstacle to peace out of the way. That obstacle is, of course, Vladimir Zelensky. There's talk that there's going to be elections in Ukraine on the 26th of October. The former president, Poroshenko, has apparently confirmed that. I think that is far too late for the Americans and for the Russians. I think they will want the elections to take place much sooner than that. The October 26th date, I suspect, has been picked by Zelensky in order to delay the date for the elections as far as he possibly can. But American articles are now appearing, including one in The Hill, which referred to Zelensky as the Mad King of Kiev. Just saying. So the Americans are going to shuffle Zelensky off the scene. The Russians are preparing Viktor Medvedchuk, the exiled Ukrainian politician who's currently in Moscow. They're clearly grooming him to take over. There is going to be peace, or so it's starting to look. That is the product of a Russian victory. The Americans and the Russians are going to try to come to agreements. All of this, of course, depends on whether or not the British and their friends can be prevented from sabotaging this process. That is going to be the big question over the next few months. We'll see where this all goes. Well, this is my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Tomorrow I'm going to discuss the military situation in Ukraine again, and I will explain that despite some articles that have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and in the Guardian, the Ukrainians have not stabilized the situation, and that the Russian advances are in fact accelerating. But this is me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.